Hello, welcome to the first lecture of Plato's Theaetetus. My name is Professor Cook. Happy New Year. Thanks for waiting. This is going to be a good class. In today's lecture, I only want to say a few things to help you situate this dialogue within Plato's broader corpus, his broader body of work. And I want to say very briefly some of the things we know about when this dialogue was composed, what other dialogues were composed before and after it, and what that can tell us about this dialogue, as well as what puzzles this dating of the dialogue presents to us. I also want to say a little bit today about dialogue form. What does it mean to write a dialogue? What does it mean philosophically to write a dialogue? What does that mean for us as readers when we encounter a dialogue? And just a little bit about Plato himself. So to dive right in, Plato's dialogues. To start off with the information about Plato, a bare bones biography. Plato lived from 424 to 347 BCE. He wrote approximately 30 dialogues. We are lucky in that most, if not all of these, appear to have survived. Highlights among Plato's dialogues, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, we have works like the Apology of Socrates, works like the Phaedo, the Meno, works like the Republic, works like the Sophist, the Theaetetus, and so on. In addition to his great philosophical work, Plato also managed to found a philosophical school, an institution called the Academy, which is fairly often, and with good reason, treated as the first university. This institution, the Academy, was located just outside of Athens and basically served as a kind of center for philosophical activity. It nursed a number of philosophers. Famously, Aristotle was passed up as the head of the Academy. He didn't receive that honor. The Academy, after Plato died, became a sort of skeptical institution for a while. In the time of the philosopher Cicero, who is Roman, we hear about the Academy as a kind of skeptical school of thought, a school that really takes up some of the skepticism we see in the questions of Socrates. After that period, when the Academy represented skepticism, it became a Neoplatonist institution. Neoplatonism being a sort of metaphysical explosion of ideas of immaterial realities that occurs after Plato's death. The legacy of Plato, and Socrates for that matter, was taken up by different people at different times throughout history. And immediately after Plato's death, there were a number of people who claimed to be doing what Plato was doing. In some cases, even carrying on the exact same intellectual work with the same concepts that Plato was using. Many of these individuals held theories that were quite a bit different than Plato's own. Now, the Academy existed for a few hundred years. It was shut down in the 6th century AD by a Byzantine emperor, very famous emperor named Justinian. This occurred because Justinian ordered a general closing of pagan sites. So Justinian, Christianity is spreading through the old Roman Empire very quickly. The Byzantine Empire represents what you would call the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. The Roman Empire splits. The western half gets overrun by Germanic peoples. and the eastern half lives on, carries on a lot of the traditions. At some point, the eastern half becomes Christian, and the academy is shut down. Now, when the academy is shut down, it is, of course, a tragedy, but it's not a great tragedy because the academy at this point has already started to recede as an institution. It was hobbling along, crippled in certain ways. And so its closure isn't quite the great tragedy that we might have expected, knowing that this institution was started by Plato. It still is a tremendous loss. Plato, of course, is also the teacher of Aristotle. And really, together with Aristotle, Plato shaped the Western intellectual tradition for a couple thousand years. Philosophical thought, political thought, to a lesser extent scientific thought, was shaped by Plato, and also religious thought. One of the things that it's worth mentioning, since I'm bringing up the historical influence of Plato and Aristotle, which is absolutely immense, is that there was a period, the so-called medieval period, when the influence of these figures was often more indirect within Europe proper than it was direct. The period referred to as the Middle Ages, sometimes known as the Dark Ages, was dark for several reasons. One of those reasons, though, was that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, people in places like Rome, places like Athens, Europe in general, lost touch with the intellectual insights that we look for when we study individuals like Plato and Aristotle today. These insights still lived on in other forms. Sometimes there would be a sort of almost, you might call it like a Cole's note summary of some central doctrines of Plato or Aristotle that would get passed around. But a lot of the influence of Plato and Aristotle in the Middle Ages was secondhand. Individuals wouldn't necessarily have access to the whole primary text that we have. I say this just because if you love studying this stuff like I do, it's important to realize just how lucky we are. You can go on the internet and search for a translation of a work like the Theaetetus and get it immediately. There were many people who lived in Athens a few hundred years after the fall of the Roman Empire who couldn't do that, period. And obviously not just because they didn't have the internet, they couldn't get their hands on a Platonic text at all. This ends during the period known as the Renaissance. Why does it end? Because the tradition that in some ways went dark in Europe proper during the medieval period was kept alive by the great Muslim civilizations that were thriving while Europe was in a dark period. Cities like Damascus in modern-day Syria, cities like Baghdad in modern-day Iraq, cities like Cordoba, modern-day Spain, these places kept the tradition of Plato and Aristotle alive during the period that in Europe was the Middle Ages, and in these places is referred to as the Islamic Golden Age. So the Renaissance is the Renaissance because these ideas were recovered. How are they recovered? Because of the Crusades, a war in which the Christians of Europe tried to retake places like Jerusalem from Muslim peoples who had taken them over. Ironically, this attempt to do battle with these individuals ended up allowing Europe to get in touch again with primary source texts that had become lost in many ways. That's a brief history. There's a lot more I could say that I find fascinating. Could go into why these ideas ended up receding. Has a lot to do with paper and the price of paper, the fact that the price of paper rose precipitously in Europe proper during the Middle Ages. But I could go on for hours about this. It's very fascinating stuff. And I think it's important, too, because it's very important to understand that things are not always going to be the same as they are now. Even something like Plato and Aristotle can disappear from the face of Athens for a long time, and maybe never even be recovered. Might not have been if things hadn't happened as they did. Anyway, let's go on. So, I want to talk now about the dialogue form. The dialogue is, of course, a work in which more than one person speaks. There are other philosophical works that are written in this form. In the period immediately after Plato, you have philosophers like Cicero, who was writing in ancient Rome. He writes dialogues when he writes philosophy. You also have people a little bit later on, like Augustine, who writes some dialogues. The medieval philosopher Anselm writes a number of dialogues. Not surprisingly, the dialogue form is reborn in some ways as a way of sharing information during the Renaissance. In the early modern period, you also get some dialogues. George Berkeley, influenced by Plato, wrote some very famous dialogues. This dialogue form was historically fairly common, but if you've taken philosophy classes in your time at UCLA, unless you've done people like Berkeley or Anselm or Plato, chances are you haven't read a lot of dialogues. Nowadays, when philosophers write, they tend to write in essay form. There are good reasons to prefer essay form when you're doing a certain kind of work. Essays don't really leave much to the imagination when it comes to what an author's actual views are. They certainly do leave many things obscure. If you've ever read someone like Immanuel Kant, you will see that even writing an essay doesn't necessarily mean that what your actual view is gets communicated. Essays are also able to get right to the point without introducing dramatic elements that dialogues include, and so on. But there are also certain advantages to the dialogue form. So I say on this first slide, Plato's works are almost entirely dialogues, and this gives his work a unique character. The character that this gives his work, I would say, is, first of all, dramatic. Obviously, a dialogue can contain a lot of drama. You can have characters like Thrasymachus in the Republic, who are basically described in almost violent terms. They're so angry about ideas that they appear like wild animals. You also have dialogues like the Crito, where Socrates is in prison, awaiting execution, and one of his best friends is trying to convince him to leave. There's a great room for drama in a dialogue. The theatetus is not terribly dramatic, but many of Plato's works are. So first of all, dialogues can be dramatic. That can be a bad thing in philosophy. It can also arguably be a good thing. Secondly, and I think more to the point for our purposes, reading the theatetus, dialogues can also be exploratory and non-dogmatic. By these two terms, I mean to refer to the fact that in a dialogue form, an author is able to entertain certain arguments, explore their implications, without necessarily being committed to the truth, the value of those arguments, or their conclusions. In a dialogue, an author like Plato can show us people thinking out loud in a way that you seldom find in an essay, at least intentionally. Usually an essay is supposed to represent someone's considered pronouncements, almost like Moses coming down from the mountain and saying, "This is the truth I have seen." In a dialogue, someone can give us an idea that an author might have entertained without necessarily committing themselves to. So in a dialogue, not all the arguments and conclusions presented need to be, or even can be, good ones. It would be terrible if every argument in a dialogue was great, because then we wouldn't have much dialogue. You would have one person speaking and another person saying, "Yeah, that's excellent," which you sometimes do find in Plato. So that's what I mean by exploratory and non-dogmatic. Dogmatism refers here to the idea that someone has a point that they're presenting and they don't question it. Dialogues by nature include lots of questions and lots of answers, and then lots of counter questions to those answers, and so on. So one of the great things about a dialogue, like the theatetus, is that Plato is able to entertain, to explore a lot of different points of views. Some of those points of views he clearly doesn't have a lot of sympathy for. Other points of view that are presented are maybe closer to what Plato himself actually thinks. The great thing about a dialogue is there are lots of shades of gray in between. Now, this is a virtue of a dialogue. It can also be a bit of a problem. It can be a problem if we are interested in reading Plato's dialogues, primarily with an eye to figuring out what Plato himself actually thought. Because Plato is not a character in any of the Platonic dialogues. Socrates is, Plato is not. And although it is generally assumed, and I think correctly, that the Socrates character in many Platonic dialogues, particularly the ones in the so-called middle and late period, is more or less a mouthpiece for Plato himself, it isn't clear that even everything that the Socrates character says is something that Plato is committed to at the time when he's writing the dialogue. In some cases, the views that the Socrates character espouses are views that we have reason to think Plato rejected by the time the dialogue was written. So the dialogue is great because it allows an author to be exploratory and non-dogmatic. If we as interpreters are primarily interested in figuring out what Plato actually thought, it can pose a problem. When it comes to interpretation, there are also other advantages and problems posed by the idea that a dialogue has a dramatic setting. In a dramatic setting, we have characters. Those characters are often described to us. In many cases in Platonic dialogues, those characters are real people from history. Thrasymachus, for example, was a real person. And a lot of Plato's readers of the Republic would have been expected perhaps to even know who that was. By putting a particular argument in a particular character's mouth, a character that the audience is either familiar with from history or familiar with because there's a great description of that character, an author can give us lots of subtle clues as to how we are to understand that argument. Thrasymachus, as a great example, in Republic Book 1, is described almost like a wild animal. Thrasymachus gives some views about justice that are obviously, to this day, still very, very persuasive and seductive and compelling. Thrasymachus basically argues that justice is really just a big swindle perpetrated by people in power so as to keep other people who aren't in power oppressed. Tremendously, tremendously exciting and influential idea. Plato gives it to Thrasymachus and describes Thrasymachus as someone who is violent and wild. This is meant to be an indicator that perhaps having this particular idea isn't necessarily conducive to happiness or sanity in many cases. Right? So that's a kind of subtle clue as to how Plato perhaps wants us to understand Thrasymachus' ideas. If we are persuaded by Thrasymachus' ideas because we think they're good, the presentation of Thrasymachus as a sort of unhappy, angry figure might give us some pause about following him all the way. So, the dramatic scene can make a philosophical point. The action in the dialogue can make a philosophical point. And so on. So, the last point is a question which I've already sort of raised. To what extent can we take any views in a dialogue expressed to be Plato's own? Is the fact that Socrates says something an indicator that Socrates is speaking for Plato? Or not? In some cases, I think it probably is. In other cases, it isn't. For our purposes, it is better when writing to simply talk about what Socrates argues in the theatetus. You might want to speculate about what Plato actually thought, but I think you will find, as we read the theatetus, that if you just focus on what the characters say, that gives you an awful lot to work with without ever talking about Plato. So, I'm not saying it's not important, the question of what did Plato actually think, and there's lots of related questions like, did Plato change his mind? How much? Did Plato come to reject certain views that he earlier espoused, and how much? There are lots of questions about the Socrates character, especially in the early and middle dialogues. How much is that character intended to represent the views of the actual historical Socrates? These are really fascinating questions. But they aren't the only thing that we should be interested in when we are interested in these dialogues. Plato wants us to be interested in arguments. That's perhaps why he wrote dialogues. There are other historical reasons, perhaps, why Plato wrote dialogues. First of all, you have to understand that Socrates didn't write anything, and that a lot of what Plato was doing and calling philosophy for the first time was something new. And so there wasn't an established form in which to create philosophical works. Also, remember that Plato was heavily inspired by Socrates, who was in some sense or another his teacher. Socrates didn't write. What did Socrates do? Well, Socrates went out around Athens into the agora, the marketplace, and other locations, and spoke with people and had dialogues. So I'm sure that a good part of the reason that Plato writes in dialogue form has to do precisely with the fact that he starts his career writing about the historical Socrates, trying to preserve some of the ideas that Socrates brought into the world, or at least into the pocket of the world that was Athens. And that dictates that he's going to write dialogues. He continues, perhaps, to write dialogues with the Socrates character because he sees his work as an extension of what Socrates started. So, on this slide we have a little table which follows ideas laid down by someone named David Ross, one of the late 19th century scholars who really bequeathed to us a great number of texts of figures like Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle. Ross did a lot of thinking about how these dialogues were written, how they were transmitted, also things like the order in which they were written. So we have here the so-called Orthodox Chronology that Ross laid out in a book called Plato's Theory of Ideas. This Orthodox Chronology started with Ross. It's orthodox because I think most people who study Plato are more or less in agreement with these categories. You can see here there are 3 categories: early dialogues, middle dialogues, and late dialogues. There is an ordering within each section. So the early dialogues lists Euthyphro first, Cratylus last. Middle dialogues lists Symposium first, Phaedrus last. Late dialogues lists Parmenides first and Laws last. This ordering is also meant to represent, at least for Ross, the order in which the dialogues were written within each section. But once you get to the order of the dialogues within a particular period, there is usually a lot less consensus. The existence of the 3 broad categories is not controversial within scholarship on Plato. Pretty much everyone who works on Plato in an academic context will accept this division into 3 periods. And that's because the dialogues in each of these 3 groups share with one another a number of common features in terms of how they are written, what they are about, also their approach to the material covered, stylistic features, and the role of the Socrates character. Okay, so there are good reasons for this 3-period chronology. These reasons are precisely why our class is called Plato Late Dialogues. There's also a Plato Early Dialogues class. Interestingly, UCLA doesn't have a Plato Middle Dialogues class. I've taught the Republic as a late dialogue, but it should, strictly speaking, be a middle dialogue. So you can see the early dialogues include works like the Euthyphro, the Protagoras, the Euthydemus, the Meno, the Gorgias, the Cratylus, and others. There are, of course, several missing from this list of early dialogues. If you were in my Greek philosophy class last quarter, you will notice that the Laches, dialogue on courage, is missing. The Crito, dialogue that takes place in prison, is missing. The middle dialogues, we have the works I think that people at least know the names of most often. The Symposium, the Phaedo, the Republic, the Phaedrus. Republic, of course, being Plato's most famous work. Finally, we have the so-called late dialogues: Parmenides, Theaetetus, which is our dialogue, Sophist, Statesman, Philebus, Timaeus, Laws. So we have these 3 categories. To go through each of the periods and indicate why they are considered to constitute distinct periods, starting with the early dialogues. I have glossed the early dialogues with the common descriptor here, Socratic. Plato's early dialogues are often referred to as Socratic. And this is because scholars generally agree, I think almost unanimously, at least in academia, within universities, I think pretty much everyone, if not everyone, agrees, these dialogues are Socratic because they appear to try to represent the person and the views of the so-called historical Socrates, meaning the Socrates that actually lived and spoke and walked around Athens. We can tell that the Socrates that appears in these dialogues is somewhat closer than the Socrates that appears in middle and late dialogues to the actual historical Socrates, because we have, luckily, independent testimonies that are not Plato of what Socrates believed. Okay, this appears in thinkers like Xenophon, Aristophanes, who wrote plays mocking Socrates. Xenophon is a better source. In these figures, we have reports of Socrates having held certain paradoxical theses that are very similar to the theses we see being discussed and defended in the so-called Socratic dialogues of Plato. For example, there is a phenomenon called akrasia. It's often translated, not quite correctly, I think, somewhat misleadingly in English, as weakness of will. This is the phenomenon of believing that one thing is the right thing to do and then not doing it. Socrates, in the so-called Socratic dialogues, is often concerned to deny that this is possible. And if we look at the works by Xenophon that include Socrates, or the views of Socrates, we find that that thesis is closely associated with Socrates there as well. Other things that are famously associated with Socrates in Xenophon, Aristophanes, and other reports, there's the alleged ignorance of Socrates. The historical Socrates famously held that he didn't know anything except that he didn't know anything. There's also a kind of philosophical method called elenchus, which consists in Socrates trying to get a definition of an ethical term from an interlocutor and then asking a series of questions that force that interlocutor to contradict themselves. Okay. There are these different Socratic tendencies, we could call them, that are attested to in sources other than the Socratic dialogues and associated with the historical Socrates. And so we know that dialogues like the Euthyphro, the Protagoras, and so on give us a figure that is closer, maybe not identical to, but certainly closer in ideas and spirit to the actual historical Socrates who lived and breathed in 6th century Athens. One of the major early works of Plato that's missing from this list, presumably because it's not really a dialogue, is the Apology of Socrates. That is a work that almost certainly gives us something close to the historical Socrates. Why? Because it purports to describe, and actually is giving us a description of, an actual historical event. And many of the people who read Plato's Apology of Socrates would have been alive at the time when Socrates gave the words. Some of them may have even been in the audience. Or, through hearsay, would have known what was said. So, in that case, Plato had good reason not to play with what actually happened too much. These early Socratic dialogues are Socratic then because they try to give us the actual Socrates who lived. These dialogues share some other features. They typically involve Socrates and a primary interlocutor. This is true of the middle and late dialogues as well. The interlocutor in these early dialogues, though, more often than not, claims to have knowledge of some key ethical concept. Moreover, there's a certain narrative structure to these dialogues that typically begins with Socrates running into one of these figures on the streets of Athens, surmising because of the words of the figure in question or the actual position held by the figure in question that this person should know something about a particular topic of ethical salience, an ethically important topic. Socrates then begins to cross-examine this person to see whether they actually know what they either purport to know or in any case should know given their position in society. So to look at the list, Euthyphro, Socrates encounters a priest, wants to know, does this priest know what holiness is, or what piety is, depending on the translation. Protagoras, same thing. Protagoras was a very famous sophist. Socrates goes and talks to Protagoras, thinks that Protagoras should know some things about virtue and whether virtue can be taught. After all, Protagoras was a sophist, a famous teacher. One of the things Protagoras is supposed to give to the pupils is virtue. What better person to ask the important question, can you teach virtue or not? So in these early Socratic dialogues, we typically see a focus on just one ethical concept. Can be holiness, can be courage, can be wisdom, can be temperance. And Socrates talks to someone who ought to know something about this topic, tries to test this person's knowledge. This knowledge, and this is something that we also see in a dialogue like the theatetus, this knowledge is assumed by Socrates to come in the form of a definition. There's an assumption which we'll talk about because it does influence some things that happen in the theatetus as well. There's an assumption that Socrates makes that Plato never really lets go of, and that's that if you know something about a concept like piety or knowledge or holiness, you ought to be able to tell us what that is in a definition, and that that definition plays a central role in your knowledge of all of the other facts you might want to know about the concept in question. Okay, so this is what we find in the Socratic dialogues. It's also what we find in dialogues like the Republic, and it's what we will find in the Theaetetus. The topic, of course, that we're trying to define in the Theaetetus is knowledge itself, episteme in Greek. In these early Socratic dialogues, Socrates questions the interlocutor using the so-called dialectical method. We can say more about this method in these early dialogues. It's typically referred to as elenchus, which means something like cross-examination. This method of elenchus works particularly well when representing the historical Socrates, precisely because it doesn't require the Socrates character to commit to any positive views of his own. Elenchus is a kind of cross-examination like you would find in a modern-day courtroom. You put the witness on the stand, then the other lawyer or attorney cross-examines that individual, asks them a series of questions that are supposed to be answered briefly, yes or no, with minimal elaboration. And your purpose as an interrogator is to trip up the person on the witness stand. You want to get them to contradict their earlier testimony. This works particularly well when representing the activities of the historical Socrates, because the historical Socrates famously claimed not to know anything. And so, it wouldn't make sense to have the historical Socrates giving us all kinds of views in his own voice. The elenchus starts with Socrates getting an interlocutor who says, or we should assume, ought to know something about a particular topic. He gets that interlocutor to give a definition. So, what is knowledge? Then we get some yes-no questions that are deliberately chosen by Socrates to try to get the person to contradict something they've said previously. Last bullet point, these dialogues, the early ones, are also sometimes called aporetic because they typically end in what's called aperia. The word aperia, the a at the beginning, is a privative prefix. It means basically it takes away the meaning of what follows it, right? So like un. If you're happy, you're happy. If you're unhappy, it means you're not happy. So the a there means not. Peria is basically like a way through. If you think of the English word pores, you have pores on your skin. What do? Well, they let your sweat out, among other things. If something is porous, it has holes in it. Okay? Aperia refers to a state. The ia is typically used in ancient Greek to show us that we're talking about an abstract noun or concept. Aperia refers to a state where you can't find a way through. You don't have a pour. You don't have a way forward. These early Socratic dialogues typically end in aperia. This occurs when Socrates asks his questions, his cross-examination elenchus questions, gets the interlocutor to contradict themselves, and the interlocutor doesn't know how to proceed. There's a contradiction that's been discovered. The person started out with this ethical concept that they've defined. Through examination of their other beliefs, we find a contradiction between the definition they've given and some other stuff that they believe that's presumably very important to them. There needs to be some change in the beliefs held by the interlocutor. They can't all be true. There's a contradiction. But the interlocutor doesn't know what to give up and what to retain. That's an aperia. Something's gone wrong. We don't know what. This is what happens in the so-called early Socratic dialogues. We have an interlocutor who's supposed to know something about a topic, a Socrates who mostly just asks questions and doesn't contribute too many views in his own right. That Socrates asks yes-no questions meant to get to a contradiction. Lots of these interlocutors don't want to play the game. Many of them refuse. For example, Protagoras refuses to speak in the way that Socrates wants. Just say yes or no, don't give me these long speeches. But in all these cases, these figures are eventually tripped up by Socrates. Turns out they don't know what they thought they knew, and there's an aperia. So all of the dialogues on the list on the left-hand side of this slide share this basic structure, this basic format. That's why we call these dialogues early Socratic dialogues. Some of these dialogues don't have all the features I just mentioned, but I think one thing we can say about this grouping is that this group of dialogues has more internal unity. These dialogues are generally more similar to the other dialogues in the same group than they are to any dialogue in one of the other groups. There's an interesting thing which we'll talk about when we get to the theatetus a little later on in this lecture, and that's that the theatetus, while being a late dialogue, actually shares many features with the early Socratic dialogues. And this doesn't mean that the theatetus is an early dialogue. It absolutely is not. What it does mean, though, is that Plato has quite self-consciously tried to draw our attention to a late dialogue that is almost nostalgic in a certain way. It goes back in certain respects to the same format as these early dialogues. So let's turn to the middle dialogues, the middle constructive dialogues. Plato's middle dialogues are sometimes referred to as constructive. There's a good reason for this too, and certainly if you've looked at the Republic or the Phaedo, you will understand why these are sometimes called constructive. This is a dialogue that Plato uses to build a system, a philosophical system with lots of moving parts. I say Socrates now builds systems because Socrates is still the main character in these dialogues, and Socrates is now doing the work of, we can assume, Plato. Instead of giving us a Socrates that holds views that are similar to those that we have reason to think Socrates himself might have held, the Socrates character that appears in dialogues like the Symposium, Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus is a Socrates character that does Plato's own philosophical work, argues for views that scholars generally agree are closer to those that Plato himself believed in. There is no more the pretense of ignorance, of not knowing things, that we see in the early Socratic dialogues. The idea that Socrates is only going to be asking yes-no questions and not introducing views of his own is also gone. What we get, therefore, in these middle dialogues is a Socrates character who describes and explains for us, and often defends for us, several of the theories that people are most likely to associate with Plato, if they know anything about Plato at all. We find things like the theory of forms introduced in this period, defended in this period. We find things like the theory of recollection, the idea that our souls pre-existed in some sense our current existence, and were shown the objects of knowledge, the so-called immaterial forms, and that all knowledge is therefore recollection, remembering what we saw before we were embodied in our current bodies. We find things like the method of hypothesis. This one appears in the Phaedo and the Republic. We find things like the theory of the tripartite soul, the idea that our psychological, motivational mechanism, our soul, isn't just a unitary thing that makes decisions on the basis of one criterion of value, say what it is most rational to do, but instead has three parts. Has a part that responds to pleasure, has a part that responds to praise and blame, to considerations of honor, and has a part that responds to reason proper, to what we have most reason to do, objectively speaking. All of these theories are the kinds of things that you would likely find if you saw a Jeopardy category on Plato. Right? What is the theory of forms? I don't know that there has ever been such a category. I always imagine that when I go on Jeopardy, something like this might happen. Chances are it's just going to be sports and stuff that I know nothing about. But that's a good way to think about this period. This is the Plato that we know in popular culture, if we know anything in popular culture about Plato at all. These middle dialogues also drop the pretense of depicting incidents that might have actually occurred during the life of Socrates himself. So it's not just that this Socrates in these middle dialogues gives us views that Socrates himself almost certainly didn't hold. It's also that the narrative itself that occurs, the dramatic events, the meetings between different individuals that we find in many of these dialogues, don't purport to have actually happened. If you look at the so-called early dialogues, several of them are actually based around key events from Socrates' life. Socrates is in prison. Socrates is going to court in the Euthyphro to respond to charges that have been filed against him. With one exception in this so-called middle period, that being the Phaedo, these dialogues don't really try to tie in with events that Athenians would have understood to have happened within the actual life of Socrates. In some cases, the meetings that are described almost certainly did not happen. But at any rate, the meetings we see in these dialogues don't attempt to be based in anything like historical reality. It's not like they're meeting, on the planet Venus in the year 3000. Those would be the fan fiction dialogues that I myself write in my spare time. But there are meetings of individuals that probably didn't happen. Socrates meets Parmenides. No. So that's the middle period. And again, you can see why, having looked at all these bullet points, you can see why this is a fairly unified set of dialogues, and why there is fairly broad agreement about which dialogues should fit here. I want to speak just for a second, because chances are for many of you there won't be another Plato class. at least not with me. So is there really another Plato class? Ha ha ha. Of course there is. I want to point out that scholars have often given great arguments for the internal ordering of the dialogues we find in this list. The Phaedo, the Republic, and the Phaedrus I can focus on. I just recently reread a book by someone named David Bostock where he talks about the ordering of these three dialogues. I'm going to follow some of the arguments he gives, bring in some other stuff. But basically, the Phaedo introduces a philosophical method referred to as hypothesis. Actually, that occurs in a dialogue called the Meno, which is properly speaking one of these middle dialogues as well. The Meno kind of introduces this idea that when you're doing philosophy and you're not 100% sure, you should try to assume a hypothesis and see what follows from it. That's first introduced in the Meno, and there's a tentative commitment on the part of the Socrates character to this method. In the Phaedo, the hypothesis method is brought in again, and there's a much firmer commitment on the part of the Socrates character to this particular hypothesis method. Then in the Republic, we actually get a full-blown defense of the idea that hypothesis is a central part of the intellectual development of any philosopher. If anyone has read the so-called divided line analogy in the Republic, things like the allegory of the cave, this method of hypothesis is described there. And it's described as an essential part of one's philosophical development, of one's grasp of ultimate truth. So just focusing on this idea of hypothesis, we have good reason to think that the Meno comes first, the Phaedo comes second, and the Republic comes third. Because an idea that is first introduced, and introduced in a very self-conscious way, with indications that this is a new thing, in the Meno, then appears in a slightly more developed form in the Phaedo, and then appears after that in the Republic in a very, very fully worked out form, and in the guise of an essential component of anyone's philosophical development. So with this idea of hypothesis, you find a progressive commitment, a progressively stronger commitment, a progressively more developed commitment over the course of these three dialogues. It is unlikely, therefore, that the Republic was written first. Because why would you start your introduction of a new idea with a full defense of it and then later write about it like you're just describing it for the first time in a tentative way? Doesn't make sense. It would be like me giving an introductory lecture on the theatetus during the last class. To point to some further examples, in the Phaedo, we get a theory of the soul that appears to be unitary, meaning there's only one part to it. In the Republic, we see Plato arguing for the first time for the view that the soul has three different parts. In the Phaedrus, the last dialogue on this list, Plato doesn't really argue for it in the way that he argues for it in the Republic. He does defend it and describe it, but it is taken for granted in a way that it is not in the Republic. This is, again, another reason to think that there is a certain order between these dialogues. In dialogues like the Symposium and Phaedo and Republic, we get reference to the theory of forms. That theory is also present in the Meno. When that theory is discussed in the Phaedo, it is introduced as something that readers are likely to know about and associate with Plato. The idea is people who know us know that we talk about these forms things. these things called forms. We're going to talk about that again now. So just by tracing certain ideas, you can get a fairly strong sense of the order in which these dialogues were written. Moving on to the late dialogues. The late dialogues are often described as critical. This is a great description, I think, because I feel like nothing captures the attitudes of many of the dialogues on the list you find at the left better than the term critical. What I mean by critical here is that these dialogues contain a marked willingness on Plato's part to rethink, re-examine, criticize the views that he put forward in the so-called middle constructive dialogues. So, of course, the early Socratic dialogues are critical. People who are said to have knowledge are criticized quite a bit. And, of course, the middle dialogues are critical. If you've read the Republic, you know that Socrates doesn't have many things to say about contemporary Athens, the Athenian democracy, that are particularly positive. He doesn't like any of it. So there is criticism in all the dialogues. That's an essential part of philosophy, after all. The critical here refers to the idea that Plato in these critical dialogues is criticizing himself. Nowhere is this more true than with reference to the so-called theory of forms. If you look at the dialogue called the Parmenides, I wouldn't recommend it because it's a very difficult dialogue. The Parmenides subjects the theory of forms to withering criticism. There are criticisms of the theory of forms that make it look absurd. And teaching the theory of forms can often be difficult because I feel that oftentimes when students are first exposed to it, they think it's really silly. I think it's quite profound, and I think it takes a while to really keep thinking about it and keep figuring out what happens if the forms exist and what happens if they don't, to really recognize that this is quite a profound idea. When people first encounter the forms, it's kind of like what Plato says happens when you try to rescue them from the cave. They get angry and very dismissive. I'm not trying to say that I'm the Socrates figure in this narrative. Again, my own fan fiction, much of it takes place in the year 3000 on the planet Venus. I will go down in those works and rescue people, and they are often quite kind to me. They say, "Thank you, great teacher." But I do think that Socrates is right when talking about the kind of reception his ideas usually get in people who are hearing them for the first time. I say this because the critical period dialogues like the Parmenides criticize the theory of forms to such an extent that you will seldom hear criticisms of the theory of forms that are better. There are criticisms, one of them referred to as the so-called third man argument, that basically shows us that the theory of forms leads to an infinite regress. If there's a form for a concept like man, there need to be an infinite number of such forms. There's no better reason to think a theory is untenable than that. And Plato himself gives us that criticism in the Parmenides. The Parmenides ask questions like, is there a form of something like mud? Are there forms of insignificant things? This also makes the theory of forms look silly, irresponsible metaphysically. You're introducing way too many things into the universe if you want to have these forms. These late dialogues are critical because in them we find Plato subjecting his own ideas of the middle period to really, really strong criticism. The Philebus and the Sophist are a little bit less critical than the Parmenides of the theory of forms. There are still really serious issues raised. These issues concern how the forms might be metaphysically related to each other. Do the forms participate in each other. If there's a form of something called sameness, that everything that is the same as something else participates in, the sophist asks, doesn't that form of sameness need to have being? Because it exists, and if being is a form, then you get to have being on the theory of forms by participating in being. Therefore, shouldn't the form of sameness also participate in the form of being? But wait, the form of sameness is also the same as itself. It's self-identical. The form of sameness is the form of sameness. So does it participate, therefore, in sameness with respect to itself? But wait, the form of sameness is also different from the form of difference and the form of being. Does that mean the form of sameness has to now participate in difference? These questions can make your mind go in circles and really reduce someone who is ordinarily rational to a bit of a raving fool. But wait. It sounds like I might be on serious psychedelics. These late dialogues can really test readers, and I think they can make you lose your mind. And I don't mean that entirely in jest. There's a book that came out in the 60s called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's not a great book. I generally have an aversion to hippies. This is the kind of book that, like, if Jim Morrison of The Doors were going to be found with a philosophy book, like, this is what he would have. I'm not sure that he could read, but if he could, this would be the book he would have. And he was interested in philosophy. But anyway, in this book, the main character has sort of lost his mind as a result of some contact with Platonic dialogues. These are the dialogues that are going to do that. Very, very difficult. Test your patience, if not your sanity at times. So these dialogues have this critical, also you might say, a kind of tolerance for abstraction that is seldom found even in other philosophers. There's also certain new ideas that are introduced in this period. In particular, there's something called the method of collection and division, which is introduced in the Sophist, Statesman, and Philebus as a way to find what forms there are and what forms need to be held apart from what other forms. This is a way of sort of hunting for forms, it's described as. These late critical dialogues also stylistically start doing what is often referred to as avoiding hiatus. Hiatus refers to a kind of natural speech where you sometimes don't finish your sentences in the way that you would if you were writing polished prose. In Plato's middle dialogues, and even some of the dialogues on this list of late critical dialogues, Socrates writes in a very natural way that includes a lot of hiatus. This is actually, I think, a virtue of a lot of these dialogues because it makes them seem more like people actually speaking. In some of the later dialogues on this list, Plato gets into a tendency of writing in a way that is more fluid and polished, more like you would find in a rhetorician like Gorgias. He starts writing in a more polished way. He avoids this hiatus. Greek, as a language, is actually very tolerant of hiatus, even more than English. Some of the things that you read in Greek are very, very telegraphic and missing a lot of words. Just to give an example, you don't need to put the copula, the verb is, into many sentences in Greek. You can leave it out. You can just say a subject and a predicate. Dog, happy. I don't need to say the dog is happy. I also don't even need to say necessarily, in every case, the article the. But this is beside the point. These late critical dialogues tend towards removing hiatus. I point this out not because it's of any relevance to what we're going to look at in the theatetus, but simply because it is often something that scholars point to when they try to justify or defend the grouping of these dialogues into certain periods. I want to give you this idea of hiatus avoidance simply so that you don't think that there is anything that's arbitrary about this grouping of dialogues. When it comes to these late dialogues, there is, generally speaking, less of an agreement than there is when it comes to the middle dialogues about the internal ordering of the dialogues within the group that we're looking at on the left-hand side. So some people think that the Timaeus occurs earlier. Some people actually think that it occurs in the middle period. Some people think that the Philebus occurs earlier. Some people think the Parmenides belongs to the middle period, perhaps. That doesn't really make any sense to me because I think it has the hallmark of the so-called late dialogues of being critical to an extent that none of the others on this list really have. Oftentimes, there's general consensus on the ordering that you find on a list like this, but there are a few outliers who hold views on the ordering of the items within a particular list that are driven by some specific philosophical point that they think is really important. So some people want to say that something happens in the Timaeus that maybe other people don't agree is happening, and they can best defend that idea by saying, well, wait, what if the Timaeus was written earlier than we think? Maybe then Plato must be referring to this. Okay, stuff like that. I'm going to leave now the ordering of the dialogues behind. I think I've sufficiently talked about that. I'm being far more expansive in this lecture than I will be on these kinds of points than later lectures, simply because I want you to open the theatetus and know that what you're looking at is a late dialogue and understand why we have this class at UCLA called late dialogues. I want to turn now to some of the strange features, the stranger features of late dialogues. The late dialogues have certain strange features of them whose philosophical or narrative purpose is not always clear. I mean, I think this is what we often want when we want to look at late works by an artist or a writer or a thinker that we particularly respect. You know, people like, for example, the late string quartets and the late piano sonatas of Beethoven. If you're a classical music fan, Beethoven's late works are far more profound than his earlier works, often because they have these idiosyncratic features that aren't present in the earlier works. So there's often an idea that the late works of someone are going to really push boundaries because the person is at the end of their career, they've proved what they need to prove, now they really get into an exploratory mode. The late dialogues have this air of mystery to them, which really helps to cement, the idea that Plato is some kind of otherworldly genius. That's what you find also with someone like Beethoven. This idea of someone who really, in the last part of their career, broke through certain barriers and was trying to communicate in a way that was maybe not totally intelligible to other people, but that, when understood, communicates something of a great depth. So what are these strange features when we're talking about the late dialogues of Plato? Well, first of all, in dialogues like the Parmenides and the Theaetetus, also the Sophist, to some extent secondhand, there is a kind of strange framing device that takes place. What I mean by this is that before we get the actual meat or heart of the dialogue, we get an introductory preamble that tells us that what we are about to read is actually a second or third hand report of something that happened earlier and was communicated through some chain of individuals. The Parmenides is framed as a much earlier conversation that was reported to someone else who then told it to a third person, so it was reported third hand. The Socrates in this dialogue, the Parmenides, is only 19 years old, and he basically takes the role in the dialogue that in the early Socratic dialogues would typically be given to someone like Euthyphro, meaning he's really fighting to keep up with the dialectic, with the ideas, and he's more often than not on the defensive. The Parmenides, as I mentioned earlier, is really critical of certain aspects of the theory of forms, and the Socrates, who is 19 in this dialogue, is actually trying to defend Plato's middle period of forms in a certain way. So the theories defended here are Platonic. So the Socrates in this dialogue actually has a very strange role for Socrates. He's not in control. The theatetus is also framed as a second-hand report, as a later report of an earlier speech. In the case of the Parmenides, it's a third-hand report, which is really strange. I heard this from someone else who heard it from someone else who was there, and it happened much earlier. In the theatetus, we get, as you'll see when you read the first couple pages, we get the introduction of the idea that we're getting a report of a conversation that occurred 30 years prior. Both of the individuals who took part in the dialogue are either dead in the case of Socrates or dying in the case of Theaetetus himself, who's just been injured in a battle. We get a report, okay? So we get a report of an event, of a conversation that is alleged to have happened 30 years before. Socrates has been dead for 3 decades. This self-consciously serves to remove us as readers from the action. It's not immediate. It's almost like an echo of an echo in the case of the Parmenides. This is a strange feature that we find in late dialogues. The sophist continues the action of the conversation reported in the Theaetetus, but even more bizarrely, and I think maybe there isn't some kind of really mysterious, deep narrative or philosophical point to this. I think it might just be some part of how Plato composed these dialogues. In the Sophist, we see a continuation of the reported dialogue that took place in the Theaetetus, but the whole idea that this is a report is now dropped, and we're just kind of dropped into the reported dialogue as if we were in any other Socratic dialogue, any other Platonic dialogue. I say that there's probably a very, very straightforward reason for this because a lot of scholars, and I don't know enough to really pronounce whether this is correct or not, assume that probably Plato added the bit of the Theaetetus that is the frame, perhaps later, perhaps because Theaetetus was dead and Plato wanted to memorialize Theaetetus, and so he put that introduction in. And maybe that's why the Sophist doesn't continue with that pretense of this is a reported conversation, but just drops it straight in. This is another thing that I'm going to point to on the very next slide. That is that these dialogues in the late period tend to be linked. So I just mentioned that the Sophist picks up where the Theaetetus stops. At the end of the Theaetetus, there is a mention of let's do this again tomorrow. Hey, this was a lot of fun. Let's meet tomorrow morning. Do it again. At the beginning of the sophist, the characters meet again and say, hey, remember how we agreed to meet yesterday? Well, here we are. Let's do it again. And then at the end of the sophist, there's a reference to doing it yet again, and they start talking about the statesman, the politicus, defining what the statesman, the politicus, the politician looks like. There's also even a fourth dialogue that's supposed to go with this set that is called The Philosopher. Presumably it was never finished. That's what people assume. It's linked. So another curious feature of several of these late dialogues is that Plato actually groups them into these sets, like they're almost like trilogies, using certain narrative cues and thematic similarities. Okay, so a lot of what's happening here is just narrative, like, hey, let's do this again tomorrow. Okay, let's do it. That isn't terribly interesting. I mean, maybe Plato was thinking like, any of these horrible Hollywood executives when they make these sequels to films. He's just looking at the box office receipts, so to speak. I doubt it, because Plato wasn't making tons of money off of his publications. Such is what happens when very few people in your society can read and books have to be copied by hand. It's not a great way to make money. You have to start out wealthy if you want to do it, in most cases. But there are more interesting cases where it's not just that Plato, in fact, all these cases have this interesting bit. So it's not just that Plato links these dialogues by saying, let's do this again tomorrow, and then picks it up. There are also some thematic overlaps that make this significant. So just to talk about these sets, the Timaeus and Critias are linked to one another. The Critias is a dialogue where Socrates discusses Atlantis. There's a lot of debate, was this a real place or not? The Timaeus gives us a long creation narrative, how the demiurge, the creator of our physical world, created our physical world. Also a lot of scientific explanations. Those two dialogues are linked. There's another dialogue that was planned, but again, presumably not completed. I didn't write the title of it correctly. I don't really care so much about it. It says the Democrats. That is not a dialogue about the Democratic Party in the United States. It wasn't written anyway, so that's autocorrect for you. No respect for classical antiquity. The theatetus, to get to our dialogue, is internally linked to the sophist and the statesman. These dialogues, as I mentioned, are also linked to another. This is significant in our case. It isn't just window dressing, because there are certain thematic and philosophical links between the theatetus and the sophist that are important for understanding some things that happen in the theatetus itself. So one big one, it's probably the biggest one, is that in the theatetus we will see there's a long, very puzzling, and I think quite frustrating to a lot of students, discussion of how is it ever possible to have a false belief. I think that this discussion, like many in Plato, actually is quite profound and raises a lot of interesting questions once we understand that certain constraints are in place on the discussion that are causing the puzzles, and that those constraints are constraints that actually fall out of certain assumptions that people are likely to make when talking about the topic. We'll get to that later. Happens in the second part of the dialogue. What is important now is that this same issue of falsehood is also taken up in the sophist, and there, using the theory of forms, it is solved in a certain way. And so what Plato leaves aporetic and unfinished in the theatetus is actually resolved, at least in a way that satisfies Socrates and the other interlocutors in the sophist. Okay? And it's solved by bringing in the forms. It's not exactly the same question, because the question in the theatetus is more about how is it possible to have a false belief in your mind, whereas the question in the sophist is what's going on metaphysically when we talk about things that are not. How can things that are not exist? And one class of things that are not, that would be understood to be a thing that is not in the Greek mind, would include things that are not true. Okay, so the sophists, and I hope we actually get to talk about this a bit. I've said that I don't like to talk about these dialogues with anyone really, but with undergraduates because they're quite difficult. But there are places in the sophist where if we do have time, I would like to talk about some things in there. Anyway, the discussion there is more about the metaphysics of falsehood as part of a discussion about the metaphysics of non-existence, so to speak. I'm not sure that this is making anything clearer. But anyway, this is a case where the linking of the dialogues is important. Another bigger picture thing that might be important, and we'll see this when we talk about the theatetus in the next few slides, is that the sophist includes the theory of forms. The theatetus does not. And so the fact that these dialogues are described by Plato as being linked and that the sophist is a sequel to the theatetus, and the fact that the sophist in some way satisfactorily resolves something that was left as a puzzle in the theatetus, this might be able to help us understand both why the forms are not present in the theatetus, because this is a big thing about the theatetus that I'm going to get to, but also why it is that the theatetus is a dialogue that ends in aperia, because this is another big thing about the theatetus that I'm going to get to. The idea being, if you understand that the theatetus isn't just a standalone work, but goes with the sophist, you start to wonder, well, maybe the reason why Socrates and Theaetetus can't answer the question of what knowledge is and can't solve certain puzzles related to knowledge has to do with precisely the fact that the forms are not there. And so maybe the forms not being there was deliberate on Plato's part. Maybe we are supposed to, in a sense, miss the forms. Like, if only the forms were here, we wouldn't be in this difficulty. Let's call the forms and get them over here, right? Maybe we're supposed to, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Maybe we're supposed to yearn for the forms or something. Anyway, this is another feature of the late dialogues. The last thing I'll mention, I didn't mention it on the other slide, I don't think. I didn't see it anyway, is that in the sophist, Socrates is there, but he actually doesn't really speak much at all. So in certain middle and early dialogues, there are these characters who are just kind of there and they don't really say anything. Socrates actually turns into one of those in the sophist. So another feature that we could point to in at least two of the late dialogues, the sophist and the Parmenides, is there's a kind of rethinking of the role of Socrates. In the Parmenides, Socrates is kind of the one who doesn't really know what he's talking about, the less authoritative one. In the sophist, Socrates doesn't even really contribute much. In the Theaetetus, we'll see, we get a Socrates who is very self-consciously depicted and presented as a Socrates that is closer to the type of Socrates we find in the early dialogues. He doesn't try to introduce theories quite as much, or if he does, he puts them in the form of questions, and he allows the dialogue to end in aperia. He also professes ignorance. Anyway, I'm basically foreshadowing what I'm going to get to now. So next bit, the Theaetetus as a late dialogue. Here I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to put the Theaetetus in the category of late dialogue? Why are we so certain that it is there? How is it similar or dissimilar to other late dialogues? So, a late Socratic dialogue. I say, Theaetetus is uncontroversially understood to be a late dialogue. almost everyone puts it in the late dialogue category. Nevertheless, it contains many features typically associated with Plato's Socratic dialogues. I've hinted at all of these, I think, to some extent. I'm going to reiterate them now together. First of all, the theatetus begins with the search for definition. We're looking for a definition of a single concept. That concept is knowledge. Okay? That makes it very much like the early Socratic dialogues. Now, there's a big difference because in the early Socratic dialogues, the Socrates who appears there, and this is something that this Socrates character in the early Socratic dialogues certainly has in common with the historical Socrates, that Socrates is only really interested in ethics. There are questions about knowledge that can be raised. When those questions are raised, they tend to be raised in terms of wisdom, Sophia, and not knowledge, episteme. Okay? Wisdom is a kind of knowledge that has a very specifically ethical component. If you've done the class with me last quarter on ancient Greek philosophy, and you've gone through some of those early Socratic dialogues, especially something like the Laches, you see that there's even an assumption sometimes that all virtue, all ethical virtue, might just be wisdom, might be fully constituted by knowing what is right. So wisdom does show up in these early Socratic dialogues. Here, in this late, quote-unquote, Socratic dialogue, we have a concern to define a concept. The concept, though, is episteme, the Greek word for knowledge. Knowledge is not something that Socrates in the early Socratic dialogues would have been interested in, because episteme in this dialogue is not just confined to knowledge that has ethical relevance. Okay, so it's not quite wisdom. There's an interesting bit, which we'll get to next lecture, where the idea of knowledge is got to through a certain series of equivalencies, and wisdom is on that list. And I think following others, I think it's David Sedley. I have to look up the reference. It's been a while since I've read some of this stuff. Following others, I think there's a reason for this strange way of getting to the topic of knowledge that goes through wisdom. And I think maybe this has to do with the move away from the ethical towards the purely epistemological. So all that I'm trying to say here is that, yes, there's a concern with definition here, but the definition is offered of a concept, episteme, that isn't an ethical concept per se. There are kinds of episteme that are relevant to how you would conduct yourself in the world and therefore would count as ethical, but there are also things that you can have episteme of that don't really have any bearing on the kinds of ethical knowledge that Plato was exclusively interested in the early Socratic dialogues. So the first thing that we get identified as a proposition that one could know in the theatetus is that the wind is cold. You can know that the wind is cold. Now, this is not something that immediately has some direct ethical relevance. It's not like knowing what you should be afraid of, what you shouldn't, which you find in the Laches. This is just a fact. It's cold out. The wind is cold. Okay? So what I'm saying here, and this sort of serves to explain why I say a late Socratic dialogue, is that in a way, this is a Socratic dialogue because we're trying to find a definition. That search ends in aporia. In fact, 3 definitions are offered and all of them fail. The whole dialogue ends in aporia, like a Socratic dialogue. But this is not a Socratic dialogue. It's a Socratic dialogue in scare quotes because this dialogue doesn't focus on ethics in the way that the normal Socratic dialogues do. I don't want to give you the impression that this is my idea, per se. Many scholars have called attention to this fact. And generally speaking, if something is my idea, I will specify that it is. If there is an obvious reference for the idea, I will always cite that person. But this is the kind of thing where many, many people, it's kind of like common knowledge. I believe, just to talk about the literature on this, I think the book by John Cooper, which I'll be talking about in the future a little bit as we talk about the theatetus, the book by David Sedley, and probably the one by David Bostock, certainly the Bernier writing in the book that you have, if you've gotten the correct translation of this. All of these authors talk about this fact about the theatetus. Okay, so just to be clear about these ideas and which of them are mine and which aren't. Many of them are, many are not. And I try to be clear about that. It's harder when you're lecturing, obviously. I'm in the process of recording a podcast on ancient Greek philosophy, and one of the hardest things is how to include footnotes in a podcast, because I obviously want to do it for reasons of academic integrity, but it's also just very boring to do that. Anyway, not quite sure how to solve the problem. And in fact, that's the main reason why I've put off doing this podcast for a while. But anyway, coming soon, January 16th. So, anyway, we get in this dialogue 3 failed definitions, no positive account. That makes it correct, or at least not misleading, to talk about this as a, with scare quotes, Socratic dialogue. The theatetus, though, also is in a way a Socratic dialogue because it doesn't contain any explicit references to the developments, theoretical developments, we find in Plato's middle period. There's no theory of forms. There's no division of the soul into 3 parts, no tripartite psychology, no theory of recollection, etc. Now, perhaps it's understandable that you wouldn't find the tripartite soul here, because that is, generally speaking, an ethical idea for Plato. Not entirely true, though, because if you've read Republic 10, you will see that there actually are certain epistemological upshots to the division of soul. Okay, there are parts of the soul that really operate with something more like belief, the spirit, and the rational part can have knowledge. So it's not entirely irrelevant to talk about the tripartite soul in an epistemic dialogue, a dialogue about episteme or knowledge, like the theatetus is. But it's maybe not surprising that it's not here. The theory of forms, the fact that it's missing is a real head-scratcher. Recollection, too, perhaps Plato gave up the idea. It's not one of the ones that I myself am the fondest of, although I think there's a lot to it. But the theory of forms, we'll talk about it. Why is it not here? It's a big puzzle in the literature. Here again, finally, we have another big feature of the Socratic dialogues in that this Socrates in the Theaetetus, again, very explicitly claims to lack any wisdom in his own right. Okay? He is again presenting himself as someone who is ignorant. He's interested in philosophy. He thinks that having knowledge and wisdom are the most important things. Alas, he doesn't have it himself, and so he's going to talk to other people to see if they have it. This Socrates is like the early Socrates in that respect. He presents himself, honestly or dishonestly, as somebody that doesn't know. He's just going to try to help other people give birth, develop their own ideas. He will facilitate their searches. So for all of these reasons, it's correct to think of this as a kind of throwback. It's almost like, when you have an episode of Seinfeld and, George is only 20 years old. That's what Plato's doing in this dialogue in a certain way. He's giving us a Socrates that is much younger. In line with this, there's also this weird thing that happens where we get a resurrected quasi-historical Socrates. Quasi-historical, I think, comes from David Sedley. I think he was the first person to use that term, maybe not. Resurrected is my own term. So, what I mean by this is that in the theatetus itself, we get told very explicitly that this is a report of a much earlier conversation and that Socrates is dead. Okay? Socrates has been dead for 30 years. We get this reference to this happened before, now Socrates is dead. This doesn't happen in other dialogues. So when Plato is writing the Republic, Socrates is dead. And the Socrates in that dialogue is giving us all kinds of theories that belong to Plato and that the actual Socrates probably had no idea about. But Plato, in a sense, carries on with the Socrates character after he's killed him off in the dialogue, the Phaedo. So basically, in the early and middle dialogues, the Phaedo's and middle dialogue, you get a set of dialogues that are connected by the fact that they all involve in some way this narrative that Socrates is going to trial. In the Euthyphro, he gets put on trial. That he's going to go to court. In the Apology, he is in court. That he's in prison. In the Crito, he's going to be broken out perhaps, but he doesn't want to be. And then in the Phaedo, famously, Socrates drinks poison and dies at the end of it. But in other middle dialogues, Socrates is still there. And now this Socrates is almost like, I don't know, I don't read a lot of comics, but one of my best friends does. I know that sometimes there are these like different universe, alternate universe, it's like this isn't the Superman from the real Superman universe. It's some other, I don't know what they call them, but there's all this crazy zany stuff. This is kind of like that, in that Plato kills Socrates off in the Phaedo, and then you read the next issue of, the Plato comic, and there's Socrates again as the main character, and he's different, he's a different Socrates that is not the same as the other one. Then in the Theaetetus, Plato basically says at the beginning, Socrates is dead. He died 30 years ago. Here's some stuff that he did when he was alive. In fact, very close to his execution. And even though I've written to you about stuff that happened before Socrates' execution before, in dialogues like the Phaedo, I'm now writing this, and I'm going to self-consciously make a point of telling you that this actually happened a long time ago and Socrates has been dead in the intervening period. So it's almost like Plato wants to draw our attention to the fact that Socrates is dead and that this happened in the past so that he can resurrect the image of the historical Socrates to a certain extent in this dialogue. So he's giving us a Socrates character that is more like the historical Socrates. I say quasi-historical, following, as I said, I think David Sedley in the book called The Midwife of Platonism. I'll put up references to the big pieces of secondary literature in case anyone's interested. You certainly shouldn't read it when writing your papers. I don't think it's super helpful. But if you want to follow up further, I can give you some definite references. Okay. So quasi-historical is not my term. It is quasi-historical because this figure is like the historical Socrates in certain ways, but this is not supposed to be an actual event involving the historical Socrates. Okay. So Socrates here, in a sense, he's like Socrates because he purports to be ignorant and he engages in elenchic question and answer style dialect more than he does in, say, the Republic. He's also not quite like Socrates because even though he doesn't bring up stuff like the forms, it's clear that this is in the background in some of his questioning. So there is this resurrected quasi-historical Socrates, a throwback to the historical person. It's like Plato wants to wipe the slate clean and say, look, those things that the other Batmans or the other Supermen did, that wasn't the real Superman. That was like the rare Earth or whatever. I don't know what any of this stuff is. But who even knows? I mean, anyway, I don't know why I'm using this analogy when I barely understand it, but it's pretty Baroque. It's basically like Plato saying, look, that other person, wasn't actually Socrates. Wasn't not Socrates, but now we're going to talk about the actual one again. Anyway, one of the things that happens in the theatetus with this new old Socrates is that Socrates' activities as a questioner are in a sense given a different interpretation, and whereas they were earlier viewed as a purely negative thing, showing other people that they don't know, now they are being reconstrued as a kind of positive thing. Now Socrates describes himself, and we'll talk about this description next lecture, as a kind of midwife, meaning a kind of figure who doesn't give birth himself to new ideas, but helps those who are pregnant with ideas successfully deliver them. He also tells us that he is able to matchmake. He says that these midwife figures are also really good at setting people up with each other who are likely to produce good offspring, good children. He says he can do that with ideas. Presumably, we'll talk about this next lecture. This is presumably what Socrates does in this dialogue when he starts talking about figures like Heraclitus and Protagoras. Okay? Theaetetus gives him this idea that knowledge is perception, and Socrates says, oh, you must mean what Protagoras meant when he said man is a measure of all things. And then he says, but if you think that, your worldview is probably similar to that of Heraclitus. This seems to be something like the matchmaking. Theaetetus has an idea. He is maybe pregnant, maybe not. I mean, the metaphysics of this don't quite map onto actual pregnancy. Socrates wants to set him up now with these other individuals who can maybe turn his possible birth, his possible offspring, into a real offspring. So, in the Theaetetus, we see in a very famous speech where Socrates describes his activities as being like those of a midwife, we see a positive reinterpretation of the role of Socrates in the lives of ordinary Athenians. In the Apology, another dialogue by Plato, the Apology of Socrates, if you've read it, you will know this. Socrates famously describes himself there as a gadfly, kind of like a black fly or a horsefly. We have these in Ontario. In California, I don't think you have anything like that, but a pest. Somebody that's coming, not Ontario, California, Ontario, Canada, the real Ontario. Anyway, Socrates is describing himself as like this annoying insect that constantly bites you. That's what he's doing when he's questioning people. He's irritating them. He has a positive purpose. He wants them to be awakened from their slumbers and start living life in a more genuine way and seeking after the things that he thinks are really important, the care of their souls, true wisdom, and so on. But his primary function is that of an irritant. He describes himself as a kind of annoying pest, insect. And what he does is show people that they don't know things that they think they know. And at the end of the dialogue, he leaves them that way. In another dialogue, the Meno, he's described as a kind of torpedo fish, which is a fish that with electricity can stun you. One of these fish, that has a special power, almost like a jellyfish. You run into it and it shocks you and you can't move. That's the way that Socrates' questioning activities are described in the early dialogues. Not very positive. In the Theaetetus, we get this new image. Actually, what Socrates is doing with his questioning is helping someone deliver a baby, an idea, bring their ideas into the world. So we get this reinterpretation of Socrates as a positive figure that doesn't just do negative stuff that maybe can lead positive stuff to happen later. No, this Socrates actually helps you get the ideas that are in you and bring you into the world. Sorry, bring your idea into the world. This is actually, interestingly, even though it only appears in this dialogue, this is the Socrates idea that people have when they speak about the need for using Socratic methods in, say, high school classes or university classes. A lot of people say, I teach, you have to write these, I think, generally silly teaching statements when you're applying for jobs that say, this is the kind of teacher I am in the classroom. And I think they're silly because everyone writes the same thing. And most of the people who write this don't do any of the stuff that they say, or if they do, they're not good at it. And most of the stuff that people write isn't very good anyway. It's sort of like, I'm going to let every student control the class, and I'm not going to have anything to say. Even though I'm the expert, I'm going to let everyone else talk. Not good ideas. Anyway, shouldn't go off script here. But the type of a person that they mean to be when they say that they employ Socratic methods in the classroom is the Socrates that we find in the theatetus. They don't mean I'm going to be like Socrates in the Protagoras. I'm going to show somebody who thinks they know everything that they're actually an idiot. No one means that when they say they're going to be Socratic. They mean that they're going to be, it's called myeusis. It's a word for childbirth, for helping a birth. That's what they mean. They're going to help young minds develop their ideas to the fullest potential, and then subsequently argue with them that they're not going to change their grades because those grades were well-deserved. Anyway, we'll talk about grading next lecture, I think. That's ominous. So, question, to get back on topic. Big question about this dialogue. Where are the forms? Why do we have this question? Well, we have it because the theatetus is a late dialogue. And because it's a late dialogue, we would expect the forms to be present, especially because it's a late dialogue about knowledge. And if the forms are anything in a dialogue like the Republic, they are meant to provide an answer to the question, what is knowledge? In the Republic, we learn whatever knowledge is of forms. So this is a real puzzle. Not to mention this focus on knowledge, where is exactly where you'd expect to find the forms. There are certain puzzles that are raised in the dialogue where if you're aware of the theory of forms, you almost can get frustrated and say, why aren't you talking about forms here? Wouldn't you be able to answer some of the questions that you have here if you just talked about forms? So there are no forms explicitly mentioned in this dialogue. That's a puzzle. Why not? And to make matters worse, this is a dialogue about knowledge, and in dialogues like the Republic and the Symposium and the Meno and the Phaedo, the forms are brought up precisely when we want to talk about knowledge. In the Republic, the forms are the answer to the question, what is it that we can have knowledge of? The items in the sensible world are things that in the Republic are objects of belief. So here we're talking all about knowledge and we don't talk about the forms. Why? One suggestion, which I don't think anyone takes that seriously anymore, and I don't think it's a great suggestion, is that maybe in the Theaetetus, Plato doesn't talk about forms because he's lost his belief in forms. I don't think this is an idea that we should take seriously at all. It's true that in the Parmenides and other late dialogue, Plato has serious issues with forms. He points them out. But I think really what's happening in these critical late dialogues with respect to the forms is that Plato is so convinced that something like the forms have to exist if knowledge and discourse are actually to be about something. So if when we talk about stuff like courage, if we're actually talking about something, or justice, the forms have to exist. Plato is so committed to this idea by the late critical period that he's actually very comfortable being very critical of the theory that he's advanced at any particular time. It's almost like if someone converts to being a theist. So someone was an atheist, now they believe in God, in some particular denomination. They're Christian, they're Muslim, they're Jewish, what have you. it's almost like at first when someone converts, they can be quite sensitive, and all they want to do is argue for God's existence. And all they want to do is defend constantly the idea of God's existence from criticism. So if you want to talk to them about the problem of evil, they're going to fight you. And they're going to be very resistant to change. Because maybe on some level, they're scared that their God doesn't exist. But when people convert religiously, sometimes they get to a more mature phase where actually they're more willing to be open-minded and they're more willing themselves to raise skeptical questions. And this is actually a part of their mature faith. And this happens when it does, I think, because people can sometimes come to see with a great deal of stability that they do believe this thing, and they've gone through certain interpretations and problems in their head, and they're not scared anymore. And now there's a tremendous freedom where they can actually walk around this idea and ask questions of it and try to see where it gives in and where it holds firm. Okay, I think that's really how we ought to understand the critical period when we're talking about the forms. And I think that what we find in dialogues like the Parmenides and the Sophist, paradoxically, isn't an indication of less faith in forms on Plato's part. It's an indication of more faith. So the Sophist is a good example. The Sophist asks certain questions about forms that looks like they're either really difficult to answer or they're absurd. These questions arise naturally when you believe in forms. Plato calmly tries to provide responses, and in some cases he actually provides responses that he thinks are satisfactory. But that's because he's convinced that something like forms have to exist if we are going to know anything, if when we speak, we are speaking about something real. Okay? Another way to another analogy, just to get clear about what the point I'm trying to make is, when people first started espousing the theory of evolution, there was also a lot of sensitivity, because at the beginning, you really had to watch out. You might end up on the wrong end of a religious inquiry, right? You don't want to end up on the wrong end of, say, the Catholic Church. And so in that early period, you do find certain early evolutionary theorists who are more sensitive and less interested in certain questions because they're afraid that the theory is going to fall apart. Darwin isn't actually one of these. Darwin is quite exploratory in many ways. But you do see in far later evolutionary theorists, like people who are writing now, there are ideas like punctuated equilibrium, whereby the kinds of changes that occur in evolution actually happen really, really quickly, not over a gradualist period of time. These are kind of like the analogs of the kinds of questions Plato is willing to ask in the later dialogues about the forms. Because these people now are so convinced that evolution has to be the right explanation of the phenomena that we see, that they're not scared of asking these big questions that in the beginning would have threatened the very existence of the theory itself. So anyway, so I'm going to skip this slide. Question: why are the forms missing? There have been three very plausible views about why the forms are missing that I'm going to talk about now. I'll give you the names associated with all of them. I mentioned all these people except Francis Cornford. So each of these, I think, has something true in it. So the earliest such theory, Cornford, 1935. Cornford argues that Plato deliberately leaves the forms out so that the dialogue, say dialectic, so that the dialogue can end in aperia, in a state where there's no way out, a state of confusion. Cornford suggests that Plato does this, and I think he's right here. I think all three of these theories are right. They also overlap to a significant extent. By doing this, Plato wants us to see that, in fact, when we try to define knowledge without bringing forms in, we understand that you cannot do it. So Cornford introduces this idea that maybe the fact that this is an aperatic dialogue that ends in perplexity and the fact that the forms are not present, maybe these two things are really closely linked. Because Plato is trying to teach us something. He's trying to show us what happens when we don't talk about the forms and we want to talk about knowledge. And of course, if we've read The Republic, we see a very dogmatic Plato saying, look, forms are only of knowledge is only of forms. And he really isn't willing to countenance the question, well, maybe there are no forms. Can there still be knowledge? If you said that to the Socrates in The Republic, I don't want to say he's going to attack you, but he's not going to be very happy. He kind of just speaks dogmatically. If you've ever read the Lovers of Sights and Sounds passage in Republic 5, I started trying to teach it in the last class, and it's very difficult, so I kind of gave up. But there, Socrates kind of just argues, look, here's how it is. Here, in this dialogue, the forms aren't even mentioned, and we get a sort of redo of the knowledge topic again. Maybe the point is, Cornford suggests, and I think he's right here, that we are supposed to feel the lack of the forms and understand that we need them, or else we run into all these problems. The forms, of course, we know from the Parmenides and the Sophists, introduce all kinds of problems of their own, but maybe the problems they solve are significant enough that they outweigh the problems they cause. Bernier, who wrote the introduction and notes to the wonderful translation that you are reading, which is not by Bernier. It is by Levitt. Bernier argues that Plato might be, this is following up Cornford's suggestion, you can see this, that maybe what Plato is doing is actually trying to act as a midwife for the reader. He brings us to a point where we might be able to see what a correct definition of knowledge would look like, and what he wants us to do is understand that in order to really figure out what knowledge is and solve the puzzle, you need to introduce the forms. And so the idea here is maybe Socrates is doing to us, Plato is doing to us what Socrates did to other individuals. He's working as a midwife to us, and he brings us just to the point where we might be able to come up with a definition of knowledge ourselves, and we might see the need for forms, but he doesn't bring us all the way there, because we need to take that last step for ourselves. This is Bernier's suggestion. Sedley, 2004, argues that Plato's theatetus is partly intended to show us a kind of intellectual biography on Plato's part. So Sedley really ties together this idea that now we have the old Socrates back, and this suggestion I was making earlier about the fact that this Socrates is understood not as a destructive person who irritates you, but as someone who helps you give birth to new ideas. Sedley wants to suggest that maybe what Socrates is trying to do in this dialogue is what Plato's trying to do in this dialogue is bring Socrates back in order to show us that, in fact, it was the questioning of Socrates that led Plato himself to recognize that forms need to exist. So the idea here is that Plato is giving us, in a strange way, an image of how it is that Socrates figured in his own, Plato's own intellectual development. The idea is that, Socrates, as depicted in the early dialogues, didn't give his own ideas, just ask questions. And so when Plato puts the idea of the theory of forms into the mouth of Socrates in dialogues like the Republic, that's not Socrates. What Plato is trying to do in the theatetus, Sedley suggests, is give us an idea of why it isn't quite totally misleading on Plato's part to say that Socrates held the theory of forms in a dialogue like the Republic. Why is it not totally misleading to have a Socrates figure espouse the theory of forms in the Republic? Answer: because for Plato, although Socrates never held the theory of forms, Socrates was the midwife that brought the theory of forms out of Plato through his questioning. Okay, so it's a complicated picture. I actually am quite taken with it, and always have been. And so the fact that it's complicated doesn't mean it's wrong. So the suggestion here is going to be that Socrates was a midwife for Plato. That is how Plato ended up with the theory of forms, because Socrates showed him, as he does in this dialogue, for us, the reader, and also theatetus, the interlocutor within the dialogue, showed Plato that you can't get definitions of anything which you would need for knowledge unless forms exist. And so in this dialogue, we see this very clearly with respect to knowledge itself. We can't define knowledge without talking about the forms. Likewise, Socrates' questioning of the sort that happens in the early Socratic dialogues got Plato himself to realize that forms have to exist. And just to fill in a key blank here, I know I'm running out of time, but I want to fill in this blank. This is the general view that scholars have when it comes to the question, why does Plato talk about forms when he gets to the middle period dialogues as an extension of the earlier interest in trying to define terms like justice? And the standard answer, and I think this is standard because it's correct, is that the Socratic dialogues end in puzzlement and confusion. And this happened in 6th century Athens when Socrates talked to various people, Plato included. And this puzzlement kept happening. And this led Plato to believe, and I think if you read the Republic carefully, you see this. This led Plato to believe that any definition of terms like justice that references sensible particulars, things in the sensible world, in the definition, is doomed to fail. Because unless you go so abstract that you're talking about structures, forms, intelligible things that really are not material in any way, you are not going to have a definition that is general enough to work. So the idea here is that the early Socratic dialogues are all historically accurate. That's how conversations with Socrates went. Plato was frustrated, and he asked himself, why is it that Socrates never got anywhere? And his answer was, well, maybe Socrates didn't get anywhere because he was looking in the wrong place. Maybe the definitions that Socrates was pushing people to find were taking the shape of pointing to sensible properties. To give you some indication of what I mean, okay, in the dialogue, the Hippias Major, I think it's the Hippias Major, there's Hippias Major and Hippias Minor, one of the two, Plato tries to give, there is a definition of beauty that's given, and beauty is said to be bright color. Well, if you know anything about these Socratic dialogues, you know that this is going to fail as a definition, and it's going to fail because Socrates is going to say, look, you say that beauty is bright color. What is Socrates going to do? Well, Socrates always does this. He's going to find a case where there's a bright color in something, and not only is that bright color not beautiful in that thing, it's also precisely the thing that makes the thing that has it ugly. Someone gave a talk, I went to Princeton, and someone gave a talk on this particular dialogue, and they pointed out Princeton has this awful orange color in its memorabilia. And this person said, imagine someone said that the orange in the Princeton logo is beauty. Well, if you just look at that Princeton logo and the coats that people wear, they're hideous. And so maybe that color of orange might be what serves to make a painting by, Andy Warhol beautiful, if any such beautiful. Andy Warhol's not good, but Turner or something. Maybe an artist that creates work of beauty can make that color beautiful. But that's not what beautiful is. And really, no sensible property is ever going to give you a definition of beauty. Why? Because for any sensible property you try to define beauty in terms of, you're going to be able to say, but that same color, that same sensible property you're saying is identical to beauty, is here, and it's precisely what makes this thing so awful. So, it's like if you say, what's beautiful is a diminished seventh chord, for people who know music. Well, maybe in this composition or this symphony or this jazz piece, but generally speaking, diminished seventh chords sound horrible. You have to prepare them when you're writing a piece of music. So the idea is, if you give any sensible property for a definition of what beauty is, you're going to find counterexamples. And so the idea is, maybe Plato was pushed by the failure to find definitions in terms of sensible properties that actually work. Maybe he was pushed by that to say, well, if we wanted to find something in a way that works, we need to look at immaterial properties that are formal or structural. Sorry, this is a long, I'm getting excited. This excites me in a way that I get carried away. Anyway, so let's go on. So this is my last slide. So the last thing, dating theatetus, this means not going out on a date with theatetus. Again, that would be in my fan fiction. This is how do we date chronologically the theatetus. I mentioned that there is no doubt or little doubt about the dating of the theatetus, where it occurs. I'm going to, in this last slide, tell you why. Cooper, John Cooper, one of my own teachers in graduate school, says the theatetus is almost alone among Plato's dialogues in being fairly precisely datable. Why? Well, as Cooper argues, I think actually following his own teacher, Will Owen, the dialogue in the preface mentions that Theaetetus has just returned from a battle at Corinth where he's been wounded. Okay. The dialogue also contains several tributes to Theaetetus' prowess on the battlefield, his acumen, his skill. It says progress, it shouldn't. And his skill as a mathematical scholar. It's also later going to mention one of the major mathematical achievements that Theaetetus was associated with. Something to do with square roots. They didn't call them square roots back then. Powers, they're called. If you've read the first 10 pages of the dialogue, as you should have, you would have seen this already. So Cooper, following others, points out that it's likely that this initial section and other parts of the dialogue were written as a kind of tribute to Theaetetus after his death following this battle. We know, because the battle is said to have taken place in Corinth, we know that there were only 2 such battles during Plato's lifetime, and only one of them, which occurred in 369 BC, lines up with the likely date at which Theaetetus, the real historical individual — I'm sorry if I didn't make this clear, Theaetetus is a real person. Okay, that's how we can date it in this way. Only the second of these 2 battles in Corinth — Corinth is where Theaetetus, in the Theaetetus dialogue, is said to have been wounded — lines up with a date when Theaetetus would have died. Ergo, we know that this dialogue had to have been written after that battle in 369, most likely shortly after that battle. Okay, so the Sherlock Holmes-style deduction here is that we know for sure that this dialogue was written after that battle. Therefore, it's got to be a late period dialogue. Plato didn't live that much longer, and so he had to have written it around this date. So we can give a pretty precise date for when the Theaetetus was written. Okay. Now, it might be the case that the prologue part was added after, but even if that is the case, the Theaetetus is tied to the sophist. And so there's more reason than just this to say that the Theaetetus is late, because the sophist is late. And so, if Plato's going to build a bridge between two dialogues, he's probably not going to say, oh, what's a sequel to the Apology? The Parmenides. It doesn't work. He's going to choose two dialogues from the same period, more or less. So this is the way we can assign a date to the theatetus. For those of you who know much, if anything, about New Testament biblical scholarship, people who try, for example, to date the book of Mark, which is presumed to be the oldest gospel, when they try to date that, figure out when it must have been written, I think the date they give is like after 69 AD. And that's because they are operating, of course, on the assumption that the authors of the New Testament were regular people. This scholarship, if it's going to be anything academically defensible, needs to proceed on the assumption that, there aren't miracles. And so these people know that the Jesus in the Bible, the Jesus figure in the New Testament, makes a prediction that the temple is going to be destroyed. They know when the temple was actually destroyed. And so assuming that the people who wrote these Gospels didn't miraculously predict the future, and assuming that Jesus is just a regular person and didn't predict the future, they therefore are able to say these Gospels must have been constructed after this date. Okay. Of course, if someone is really a believer, they're not going to need to accept any of this because they're going to say, well, no, Jesus predicted this because he was God, right? But in academia, for obvious reasons, you can't make that as your argument. This isn't the 16th century or 17th century. You can't do that. And so this is an example just to show you that's how we get the date of the theatetus, something like this. We know that there's a historical event that's referenced in the dialogue. We assume that Plato didn't predict the future. He didn't predict, that Theaetetus was going to be killed in this battle at Corinth. Therefore, it had to have been written after this date. So we know fairly precisely when this was written. I think I've probably gone over the time. I appreciate your patience. I actually intended to make this a short one. Have a great night. You'll get another lecture on Friday.